I'm going to check my back end orders. If you go to DeleteLawz.com anytime right now, order anything. I don't care if it's $5, $10, $20, $30. I don't care. I just want you to get my trifold in your car. So we see the three branches of government right here. Do you see these? And then right up above it, this is the list. If you have the poster, these are the list of all the Supreme Courts, starting back here with the John Jay Court and then ending all the way down here with the Roberts Court. He's appointed in 2005. So when you talk about a Supreme Court holding, these are the three branches of government, okay? So the congressional branch of government, what they do is they write laws. So this is the congressional branch of government right here. And what they do, whether this be a state congressional branch, so the Republicans and Democrats in Tennessee, or if this is the national representatives at the federal level, they write laws. They're lawmakers. You've heard the term lawmakers, and that's what the congressional branch of government does. Then the president of the United States, if it's federal lawmakers, or the governor of Tennessee, if it's in Tennessee and it's congressional lawmakers there, they then will write laws that the executive, the governor of a state, or the executive, the president of the United States, will then sign into law. And there's a bunch of steps here for Congress. First, it has to be introduced into committee, and then it has to go out into a subcommittee, and then they have to vote on it bigger, and then it goes out to the House, and then it goes to the Senate, and then it goes to the president or the governor of your state. This is how laws are created in the United States of America. The Supreme Court over here, what their job is, the only job that they have, the only job the Supreme Court has, is to make sure that the laws that the legislator wrote and the laws that the president or the governor signed into law, that they match up with your Bill of Rights, that your first 10 amendments and then the other amendments that are passed throughout the history of time, that the laws that the legislator wrote, that the executive signed into effect, that these laws right here don't counter or go against the rule of law. The rule of law is the Constitution. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which are listed here, that is what sets the standard for the rule of law. How do we know this? Because the 1789 Judiciary Act that was signed into law in 1789 was then found unconstitutional with the 1803 case of Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison said that the Supreme Court, what they do is they'll determine the constitutionality of law that is determined by the legislators and the president. And this is determined in 1803. Rule of law is established with the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution that says that no laws can come before this over here from back before the Constitution exists, and no laws are above this. Your constitutional rights are the metric standard for the rule of law. So now you understand. So their entire job is to look at the constitutionality of law and determine if it violates the founding documentation. And they took that power in the 1803 case of Marbury versus Madison. So I just want to make sure, and this poster I give away for free if you order anything off my website. Print this sucker out, put it on your wall. People will play with it forever. Now that you understand what the Supreme Court's functionality is, what have they done? What is the history of the Supreme Court? What have they done to us? The Supreme Court, a bunch of 9 appointed monarchs who have nothing in common with you and I. Nothing. What do you have in common with Elena Kagan? What do you have in common with Clarence Thomas? Nothing. What do you have in common with John Roberts? Nothing. What do you have in common with Samuel Alito? Nothing. You have nothing in common with any of these people. They've been appointed to a government position for their entire life with a pension that pays 100% of their salary when they were a Supreme Court justice. Do you think that when you appoint somebody to a government position for life that they could become corrupted? They can never be fired. There's no ethics committee or panel for Supreme Court justices. I don't care if it's a representative, if it's a judge. No person should ever be appointed for life to any position in government. And what has been the effect of appointing Supreme Court justices for the rest of their lives? It has been an absolute tyrannical police state, prison state, death state ever since it started. So how do I know that that is 100% true? Well, let me show you. Allow me to show you. So I'm going to show you guys an up close here version of this. So their job is to uphold the constitutionality of law. Okay. So what happens? I'm going to zoom back in over here. Terry versus Ohio passes in 1968. What three things does this do? What are the three things that Terry versus Ohio does? It creates reasonable articulable suspicion. Is reasonable articulable suspicion part of our Constitution? No, it's not. What is our Constitution? The Constitution says that the Fourth Amendment is the right of the people to be secure in their person, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized. Okay, so then what does Terry do? What does Terry versus Ohio do? Terry versus Ohio allows the police to detain you. Oh, detained. What does detainment mean? Detainment means that they'll put you in torture cuffs, in shackles like you're a slave, throw you on the ground, and you enter a POW style of arrest. But that's not what the Fourth Amendment says. The Fourth Amendment says there'll be no unreasonable seizures without probable cause. Well, then what does Terry versus Ohio do? It goes against the Fourth Amendment. So who did that to us? The Supreme Court, scholar. The Earl Warren Court did this to us. So then how bad does it get? What three things specifically does Terry versus Ohio do? It creates the officer safety policy that the cops can do anything they want to you if it's in the name of officer safety. It creates this magical detainment thing where you can be detained, but you're not seized. You can be put in torture cuffs, thrown on the ground, put in a cell in the back of a car, but you're not detained yet. Who did that? Hugo Black, lifetime member of the KKK, the lead inquisitor in the Terry versus Ohio oral arguments in 1967. It creates officer safety. It creates detainment, and it creates reasonable, articulable suspicion. Everybody says, what's your RAS? What's your reasonable, articulable suspicion? It's a made-up bullshit policy by the Supreme Court that is not law, that was never legislated by Congress and signed into law by the executive to be reviewed by the Supreme Court. That is not what happened. 9 appointed people who have nothing to do with you and I. You ever heard of John Roberts? Did you ever heard of Kenita Brown? You ever heard of her? I never heard of her. And then she's all of a sudden she's on the Supreme Court. How come? She was picked from high school. They had Kenita Brown tagged to be on the Supreme Court all the way since high school. Not for civil liberties, for big business. She'll toe the line. So once again, what three things does Terry versus Ohio do? Officer safety, detainment, reasonable articulable suspicion. All three of those are not in the Constitution. They are not constitutional. They do not live in our Bill of Rights. They were created by 9 monarchs appointed. What do you know about John Roberts, the chief executive of the Supreme Court now? What do you know about him? You know nothing. How come he got appointed to the Supreme Court? How did he get in there? The elitists who tagged him from high school then put him through a series of where they work as a clerk for this judge, they work as a clerk for that judge, and then they mold them to be statists, to make holdings that only will benefit big business. All the Supreme Court justices, right now there's a big Second Amendment fight going on. It's all a distraction. Everything the Supreme Court does is to make sure that big business gets the benefit and the little man gets screwed. Why do we keep appointing Supreme Court justices? How come that is? Because John Jay in Federalist number 3 would write in his Federalist Papers, if we appoint the right men in the right places. And that's exactly what they've done. Let's keep going a little bit so I can show you the damage that Terry... So we have the three policies, right? Put them in the comment section. What are the three policies that the Supreme Court say? Not law, not written by Congress, not signed by the executive, and then the constitutionality determined by the Supreme Court. This was judicial activism. They created the Terry versus Ohio policy at the Supreme Court level. It was never legislated through Congress and then signed into law by the executive. That never happened. That never happened. So let's go back to the three policies, because now I'm going to show you, I have this same timeline on my wall here. I'm about to teach this again. However, now let me show you those three policies put into effect. Officer safety, detainment, reasonable suspicion. Those three policies now trump all of your rights. And how do I know that's true? How do you know that's true? How do you know I'm not lying to you? Well, after we have the policy of officer safety in 1977, they passed Pennsylvania versus Mims, which says what? You have to get out of the car when ordered for what? Officer safety. You have to get out of the car for officer safety. Pennsylvania versus Mims could not exist without the jurisprudence of Terry versus Ohio. So then up here, it says 1969, Spinelli Aguilar. Spinelli Aguilar was for confidential informants. And what did Spinelli Aguilar say in 1969? It said that when a confidential informant gives you information as a copper, you have to investigate both the information you got and the confidential informant, because you have to make sure that one guy's not reporting another guy because he's his competition in business. One drug dealer will say another drug dealer on 4th Avenue is dealing drugs, so that you'll arrest the guy on 4th so the guy on 5th can own the whole block. So that's the standard. It's called the two-prong effect of confidential informants. Well, in the 1983 case of Illinois versus Gates, the argument done by the lawyer said, wait a minute. If we have reasonable articulable suspicion from Terry versus Ohio, then Spinelli versus Aguilar is dead. All the cop needs, if a cop tells me that the guy on 4th is a drug dealer, all I need is reasonable suspicion. Spinelli Aguilar is now overruled, and the new holding is that if you get any information from any confidential informant, that creates reasonable articulable suspicion. Well, then that's it, right? No. The 1981 case of Cortez versus United States expands on which policy? Reasonable articulable suspicion. This is at the border where Cortez is taking illegal immigrants across the border, but they don't have reasonable articulable suspicion. There's no reasonable articulable suspicion. There's no probable cause. They search him anyway. They find illegal immigrants in the floorboard of his car. They arrest him. He then sues, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court to Cortez versus United States. What does Cortez do? Cortez will now expand reasonable articulable suspicion to now equate to you take the totality circumstances of the scene to create reasonable articulable suspicion. How does that apply to you? You're driving down the road at 2 o'clock in the morning. The cops pull you over and you say, hey, I haven't broken any laws. And the cop says, well, it's late at night, 2 o'clock in the morning. This is a high crime area and you're driving a red car. What? You don't know any better because you never saw any of my lectures, and you're like, well, let me give you my license. Where are you heading? Oh, I'm just going over to my girlfriend's house. You invoke your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. You pull your trifold out. So Cortez expands reasonable articulable suspicion to being the totality circumstances of the scene. And this is done by who? The 9 unappointed monarchs that are appointed at the Supreme Court that you never voted for. So does it get worse? Yes! It gets much worse. It gets so much worse. The 1985 case of Tennessee versus Garner is based on the 1974 murder of Eugene Garner, a 14-year-old boy who had went into his neighbor's house and took $10 off their coffee table and ran back out the door. So Tennessee versus Garner, that happens in 74, finally gets to the Supreme Court, and that judge right there behind him, this face right here, that's named Harry Blackmun. He's going to write in the holding that, so let me give you the background of Tennessee versus Garner so you know what happened. In Tennessee versus Garner, they shoot you. The cop shows up after Eugene Garner has stolen $10. He sees him in the backyard. So the cop approaches him and says, hey, what are you doing? Eugene Garner turns around and jumps a fence and runs away. And as he's jumping the fence, as he's up on top of the fence, that copper shoots him square in the back of the head. Bullet goes in the back of the head, comes out the front. The cop had hollow tip point bullets in his gun. So then the bullet went in the back of the kid's head. It then expanded in 4 ways and blew the kid's face off. It goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, well, is it legal to shoot someone when they run away? The state has invoked the common law, the fleeing felon doctrine from common law. The fleeing felon doctrine, which is written into the 1952 Model Penal Code, which is written by who? Who wrote the Model Penal Code? This guy right here. This guy, this son of a bitch right here, Harry Blackmun. He wrote the Model Penal Code. He wrote the Model Penal Code from 1952 to 1962. Here, the Model Penal Code uses the fleeing fugitive doctrine that if a fugitive of the law is fleeing from a cop, then you can shoot and you can kill that fleeing felon. This is common law. Well, in 1985, when it goes to the Supreme Court says, well, you know what? I guess Harry Blackmun is going to reverse himself and say that you cannot shoot someone who's running away from you. It is unconstitutional for you to shoot someone. And this is the holding, by the way, for you to shoot somebody who is fleeing from you, unless what? Unless it's in the name of officer safety. You can't make this up. This is the jurisprudence of Terry versus Ohio, that the cops cannot shoot a fleeing felon unless it's in the name of officer safety, and then they can. So Tennessee versus Garner is a nothing burger. It's a nothing burger. It doesn't matter if they'd had the case at all, other than Eugene Garner was then validated. His parents, I don't know if they got a payoff or not. So you think from here, it couldn't get any worse, right? You can shoot people running away if it's in the name of officer safety, right? It gets a lot worse. It gets so fucking worse. You can't even imagine. So then they go, well, what about Wilson versus Arkansas? Tennessee versus Garner uses the jurisprudence of Terry versus Ohio. It wouldn't exist without Terry. It would be gone. The 1995 case of Wilson versus Arkansas says that cops cannot no-knock raid your home and kill you. Wilson, a black man, is no-knock raided. And so when it goes to the Supreme Court, they say, well, you can't no-knock raid people. In the United States of America, you can't no-knock raid people unless it's in the name of officer safety. And then you can no-knock raid people. The cops can get... So this happened to me in 2002. I was no-knock raided by a SWAT team. Why was I no-knock raided? Because when they were doing surveillance on me, they followed me to MMA practice at Legends Gym, where I fought MMA with a bunch of dudes. They followed me for 2 weeks. They showed me the photos of me fighting MMA against guys who were fighting in Strikeforce and for the UFC. So when they got a warrant from my house, using what? What did they use? They used Illinois versus Gates. A confidential informant told them I was a drug dealer. It wasn't true. But it doesn't matter. They followed me. I drove a Porsche. I didn't go to a job. I was an actor. So they were like, he doesn't go to a job. He drives a Porsche. He lives on Sunset Plaza. He must be a drug dealer. Using Illinois versus Gates. They didn't interview the confidential informant who was the ex-husband of the woman I was dating. No. They instead got a warrant, and then because they followed me to MMA practice, they no-knock raided me using the Wilson versus Arkansas holding. That cops cannot no-knock raid you unless, of course, it's in the name of officer safety. So let me ask you a question. How many no-knock raids are there a year? How many are there? Hundreds of thousands of no-knock raids in America a year. How do they no-knock raid your house? Wilson versus Arkansas, an extension of Terry versus Ohio. There would be no no-knock raids. I was no-knock raided. Do you get it? If you've never been no-knock raided, you don't understand me. You couldn't understand me. They no-knock raided me twice in the same month. The first time to get evidence, the second time to arrest me. They had nothing. They had a confidential informant statement and no evidence. And they no-knock raided me. That's got to be it, right? It couldn't get worse. There's not more cases based off Terry versus Ohio, is there? Actually, there are. Really? What are they? Well, let's take a look. Let's go to DUI checkpoints in America. The 1990 case of Michigan State Police versus SITS, when SITS sued for a DUI checkpoint, it's 1991, I think it is. Is it 1990 or 91? Anyway, the point is SITS versus Michigan State Police. What are the three tenets of Terry versus Ohio? Number 1, officer safety. Number 2, detainment. Number 3, reasonable articulable suspicion. Using reasonable articulable suspicion, SITS versus Michigan State Police, the police say, well, with all the DUI wrecks and all the people dying from DUIs, I'm reasonably suspicious that someone driving down this road is drunk. Using what? Terry versus Ohio. So then what happens? They then green stamp DUI checkpoints across America using the 1990 case of SITS versus Michigan State Police. The jurisprudence, the way they do it, is what case does it hinge off of? Terry versus Ohio. There you go. It couldn't get worse, could it? It couldn't get worse. Absolutely. In 1989, Graham versus Connor. What are the three tenets of Terry versus Ohio? Number 1, officer safety. What does the 1989 case of Graham versus Connor do? It creates the use of force continuum inside of police departments. What does that mean exactly? That means that they create a term at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is very good at changing the meaning of words. You're detained, you're not seized. Detainment and seized are different. So you can be detained in torture cuffs, put in a cage, but you're not really seized. Okay. So in the 1989 case of Graham versus Garner, the Supreme Court says, well, the Fourth Amendment says what? It's based on what? Reasonableness. Let me show you what I'm talking about. You have to understand the Supreme Court is based on reasonableness to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Everything is based on reasonableness. Okay. So when we get to the 1989 case of Graham versus Garner, this is going to be based on what? Objective reasonableness. Use of force against you on any scene will be determined by the objectively reasonable officer on the scene. Who determines the amount of force to be used on you? The objectively reasonable officer on the scene. I'm sorry, excuse me. What does that mean exactly? That means that the cop on the scene will determine whether or not it's reasonable to use that amount of force on you. The Supreme Court's on the top. These are the presidents on the black bar. This is the prison industry right down here and how it took off after Terry versus Ohio. This is the lynching graph right down here. And then these are the icons throughout history, these figureheads up here that kind of formed America that we live in today. If you guys like my poster, I'll give it to you for free if you get a trifold. Get a digital trifold for $9. Get a hard copy trifold. I'll email it to you right now for free. I haven't checked the orders. I haven't given away a bunch of stuff yet, but I'm going to do that right now.